The 20s gave birth to a number of works which almost immediately captured the fancy of a very large segment of the public and which have remained staples of the repertoire. In opera, there was Alban Berg's Wozzeck or Ernst Krenek's Johnny Spieltauf. In the concert hall, Prokofiev's Third Piano Concerto and a dazzling First Symphony by an 18-year-old from Leningrad named Dmitri Shostakovich. But the big news of the decade, it can now be seen with hindsight, was a work which has yet to find any real public acceptance, which even a half-century after its debut can still be described as 6 movements in search of an audience, the Suite Opus 25 by Arnold Schoenberg. The reason for its bibliographic celebrity, of course, is that it embodied for the first time on a first-to-last-note basis the system which became known as the 12-tone technique, the method which has sponsored more and more heated aesthetic debate than any musical notion, certainly since Wagner's concept of opera, to which, by the way, it's not entirely unrelated, and of which Schoenberg himself once said, "It will ensure the supremacy of German music for another 100 years." Would you believe 35? When one talks about what Schoenberg wanted to do, one can make his aims sound noble and adventurous and romantic, but when one describes how he went about doing it, it inevitably comes out sounding childish and naive, unsubtle and insensitive. For Schoenberg laid down a set of rules and regulations which, in effect, constituted an a priori notion about what a work should be and do, about the thematic substance on which it should feed, about the way in which it should suspend not only tonality, but also the most favored notation treatment of atonal music, and above all, which compromised what I think we could call the generosity of the ear, the willingness of the ear to interpret what it hears according to what it knows. Rule number 1 for the 12-tone technique decreed that all 12 tones of the temperate octave must be presented as a series of intervals, and that no one tone could reappear until each of its companions had been heard from. There was also a provision for the row to be heard from upside down or inverted, to be used in retrograde motion, a sort of and the first shall be last kind of deal, and of course in a position known as retrograde inversion, which is rather like a fly walking on the ceiling backwards. Now, as I said, the notion of a chromatically egalitarian musical language is romantic and idealistic, but it's also a theoretical contradiction in terms and probably just about impossible to realize, save perhaps with the help of a computer. And Schoenberg seems to have been about 5 minutes into the piano suite when he became aware of this dichotomy. The row which he uses for this piece sounds like this. And in that row, there is one interval which is contained in the 3rd and 4th notes, which forms a tritone, half an octave, and which also happens to be equidistant from the inaugural note. Furthermore, Schoenberg uses only one transposition of the row in this piece. He's entitled to 12 according to his own rules, 1 on each note of the scale, but he selects only 1. That 1, however, happens to be pitched a tritone higher. And the result is that in every appearance of the row, whether it's heard upside down, backwards, or transposed, whatever, that same tritone, those same 2 notes, G and D flat, keeps turning up. So 5 minutes into the piece, Schoenberg decides to live with what he's got, to turn it to advantage, to exploit it, and he writes a musette, a wonderfully witty satire of a Baroque dance movement, which was normally characterized by held or repeated bass notes. And in this case, of course, the drone effect, the held bass note effect, is our old friend, the tritone. This sense of humor, which is uncharacteristic of Schoenberg's career, I think it's fair to say, overall, is very typical of his first endeavors with the 12-tone technique. He'd been profoundly depressed about the state of his art since before the First World War. He'd written virtually nothing for a decade. And in the first 12-tone works, there's an almost palpable sense of relief. Schoenberg's Germanic mind demanded logic, and if scientific proof was unavailable, the illusion of logic would do. Whatever one may think of the system itself, I think it's fair to say that these first 12-tone works are among the very best things he ever wrote. Even in the piano suite, however, Schoenberg remains essentially a romantic composer. The big gesture is never really very far from his pen or his heart. And as the dramatic center of this neo-Baroque collection, he created an intermezzo, which has nothing much in common with the Baroque saraband, for which it is in effect a stand-in, but which I think is one of the most beautiful and impassioned of all Schoenberg's conceptions.